Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, wherever you may be. And welcome to the second of two webinars on creating spaces for science policy dialogue. My name is Philip Thornton, and I lead a flagship on priorities and policies for climate-smart agriculture. This is one of the thematic areas of CCAFS, the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. CCAFS is one of several integrating programs that link the 15 CGIAR research centres around the world. I'm hosted by the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi, Kenya, but based in Edinburgh in the UK. The aim of these two webinars is to share lessons from some CCAFS projects that have been working to help bridge the science policy divide with the aim of responding more appropriately to the needs of policymakers with demand-led evidence creation. So in these webinars, we will share some of CCAF's experience using a range of different approaches, including learning alliances and science policy dialogue forums around the issue of bringing together people interested in helping to design and implement policy on the one hand, and then scientists and engagement specialists on the other, who are interested in getting their research outputs into use. And all this with the aim of helping countries to achieve their own development objectives, as well as contributing to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We have three speakers today. They will each present a summary of their recent work in the science policy space. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes, and I suggest we go through the three presentations first. Then that will leave us some time at the end for questions and answers from our speakers, and then we'll have a brief wrap-up. So if you have any questions during the presentations, then please do type them into the box that you can see on your screen and send them to us. We have two people helping out, Laura Kramer, who's based in Nakuru, Kenya, and Kathleen Freeman, who's based in Missouri in the USA. So Laura and Kathleen will collect questions, and then we'll ask the presenters to respond to them in the Q&A session at the end. And just to say, the webinars are being recorded, and we'll make the links available on the CCAFS website for others who weren't able to attend the sessions today and yesterday. So let me introduce our first speaker today. Val Pede is the project leader of our flagship project in Southeast Asia. He's based at the Philippines at the International Rice Research Institute, IRRI. Val's project has been running since 2014 and is focusing on creating a policy information and response platform on climate change and rice in the Southeast Asia region. So over to you, Val.
Thank you very much, Phil. And hi, everyone online. So I will be giving you some overview of our experience on the PERCA project. PERCA stands for Policy Information and Response Platform on Climate Change and Rice in ASEAN and its member countries. So this is one of the projects funded under the flagship one of CCAF, and it focuses on mainly on two countries, Vietnam and Myanmar, and the main goal being to bridge the gap between science and policy, and more specifically to enable policymakers to make informed decisions on food security policies, climate change adaptation policies, and gender action plan. So as you can see, despite the fact that we have an abundant wealth of scientific research available, policy decisions sometimes are made with no clear linkages to science, though there's no scientific foundation. So why is it that we have this disconnect between science and policies? There could be several answers to that. It could well be that the relevant data, evidence, scenario that can help to decide on approaches and intervention or methods are not existing. Or maybe they exist, but not accessible to the policymakers, or they fall outside of the interest or the national priority of those policymakers. Or simply, it could also be that there are some political complexities. So There are three main key questions that this project work around in trying to connect science and policy. The very first one is to understand how science can better support decision-making on climate change policies in rice production. And then second, how can recommendations from rice science better be targeted toward the need of the policymakers? And then finally, what are the channels and engagement strategies for influencing the current climate change policies in rice production? So this project is organized around three sets of activities. And the very first set of activity is called setting the stage. So basically the main activity is here to review the existing climate change policies and the knowledge gap, and then review the policy formulation mechanism in the countries where we're working. And then the stakeholder, make a stakeholder influence mapping, and conduct surveys around stakeholder to understand better the need in terms of information to make policy decisions. And then finally, to identify some relevant case study that can inform policy. The second set of activity is called knowledge generation. This is where the major activities are to collect and analyze primary and secondary data in order to, for the purpose of generating knowledge for implication to climate policies. Capacity building, mainly targeted toward national research scientists, some stakeholders, and even policymakers. And then finally, the information profiling, where the objective is to tailor information toward the need of specific stakeholder, and I'll go more into detail on that later on. The third set of activities is about building a strategic alliance for paradigm adjustment in policy. There, the main activities to identify opportunities for delivery or communication to policymakers and facilitate alliance that can impact policy making, to facilitate the dissemination of policy document, could be in terms of research publication, activity report, or any sort of result from policy analysis. And then finally, to identify and participate in technical advisory group on food security and climate change. So these are the three major set of activities. And the ultimate goal that we pursue throughout this project is to set up this platform for policy information and response. So basically, at the conception of the project, the idea is to bring together on this platform different stakeholders at different level and scale, and link them to specific to the specific information need. As you can, this can be illustrated here by this web diagram that you can see on the PowerPoint, where a specific group of stakeholders could be interested in some aspect concerning technical adaptation, institutional development, economic modeling, education awareness, some scenario impact, in order to make a decision in formulating some specific policies. So that is the primary idea. And this is expected to be supplemented with face-to-face interaction in the form of engagement with the stakeholder. So what is exactly the engagement, the policy engagement strategy that we pursue in this project? We first started with some preliminary activities. The key thing here is to identify repeatable national institution in the policy area, institution with high credibility that can help us in pursuing our activity and reaching out to the stakeholder, and also to tag along with some international organization or some project that have similar goals as we do. So, and then this started by reviewing the climate change policy in the country in order to understand better on the knowledge gap, the national priorities, and then formulate some case studies. So our approach is more like a demand-driven approach. We work mainly on entry, by capturing entry point. Those entry points are identified by the national partners, and they alert us, and then that helps us now to identify the knowledge gap, and those knowledge gaps are formulated in case study. And then our approach, in our approach, we work jointly with the national partners on the case studies, which will be in terms of data, which will require, for instance, some data collection, some analysis, and that could lead for instance, to the development of a report, and that will lead to a policy brief. And then after that, we now conduct a series of workshop and seminar for dissemination of results together with stakeholders at different levels. So it's more like a demand-driven approach where we mainly work on case study or knowledge gap that is brought to us by the national partners. So an example of entry point for engagement, for example, in the case of Vietnam, where we work, in 2014, the Vietnamese government has started with the rice sector restructuring. So IRRI, which is the institution where I work, was invited to join the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development for the development of a proposal toward the restructuring of the rice sector. So several missions were organized with IRRI scientists from various disciplines, and the PERCA project, which I'm also leading, has also participated in several consultation meetings, which contributed to the development of a proposal. And this proposal has been approved by the Ministry of the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development. It includes a whole section on climate change adaptation and mitigation, for which our project has contributed. So this is just one entry point that we have used. Another one, which actually follows clearly from that, is the VNSIDE project. VNSIDE stands for Vietnam Sustainable Agricultural Transformation. This is a project funded by the World Bank as a result of the rice sector restructuring plan. So IRRI and IPSAC, which is the main partner of the PERCA project in Vietnam, all participate in this project and then are able to provide input and inform on several policy information. So the main objective throughout this project is improve farming practices and value chain, promote institutional strengthening and relevant public agencies to effectively support the rice restructuring plan, and also to support sustainable rice-based system. So having identified those entry points, we now, this is just one example here where a case study is formulated as a result of identifying an entry point. And I will give one example on the small farmer large scale model in Vietnam. So with the ambition of the government to accelerate the plan, the agricultural restructuring plan, there is a request to better understand the effectiveness and the potential of a land accumulation system. So at that point, there was no comprehensive and in-depth evaluation on the economic, social, and environmental impact of this model, the small farmer large scale model. So this opportunity, this entry point was brought to us by our national partners, and we used that as a case study. So to examine the economic, social, and environmental impact of the model, and then adding to that, and to see whether climate smart and sustainable practices, to what extent those can be promoted throughout this model. So this is just to show you a way how we get into the engagement process. So this has led us now to study jointly this case study together with the national partners, and this has led to the development of a working paper. So this working paper now is translated into a blog, and later on into a policy brief that is now discussed in several workshops with relevant stakeholders. So this is just to show you an example of strategy that is used from the conception of the case study up to the delivery of information to the stakeholder. So what has worked based on our experience overall engaging with policymakers in the countries where we work? The first thing I have to stress was the reputation of IRRI as a prime institution for rice science and its successful engagement in the region. That has been very, very helpful. That gave us a lot of credibility to our project when we were working in the area, given that IRRI has already established itself as a prime institution for rice research there. So that gave a lot of credibility. And then the second thing, which is also important, the fact that we use major entry point to inform policy, like focusing the moment where the government made the request to develop proposal for restructuring of the rice sector, and also the VN-Side project, which is funded by the World Bank. And another thing here, which is also quite important from the engagement process here, is to work with dynamic partners who will always alert us on those opportunities where the project can engage with the stakeholder and inform policy. This is quite important because anytime when those opportunities arrive, it is the partner that inform us, and then together we work on those specific case studies. I would like to mention also that the fact that we work jointly with the partners give a lot of credibility to the information that we provide to the stakeholder in general. So the policy work so far were very, very relevant, because from the conception of the case study all the way to the development of the knowledge or information, we hold several of those workshops. Then we were able to receive several feedback, and that was really essential. Another thing which works quite well here is the capacity building activities that we have done here. When we first conducted our stakeholder survey, we found out that there was a lot of requests for interest from the side on decision tool in order to make decision when formulating some policy. So anytime when we have an opportunity to organize a capacity building, we invite those stakeholders and even policymakers, and that was quite successful here. And when it comes to how to present information to the stakeholder to inform them so that they can make decisions, one simple thing like GIS map, for instance, to show suitability map for climate smart technologies, what happened to be very successful, because it's a quick way of informing them and showing them evidence, and that was liked pretty well everywhere where we have worked. So to end here on the lesson learned so far, bridging the gap between science and policy is very important, but the thing is, informing policy is one thing, but making sure that the recommendation will be taken further is also another thing. So that requires to engage well with the policy makers. For an effective policy engagement, from our experience of this project, we think that it is important to work with credible and repeatable national institutions, and knowing very well the national priorities and getting the interest of the policy makers, and adopt a demand rather than a supply-driven approach. And this was exactly how we have been working in this project. We mainly work on what comes from the government itself, what comes from the national stakeholder, what is requested as a knowledge gap. So another thing that I would like to stress to finish here is that it is quite important to produce scientific report and publication, but it's not the end. Those are not sufficient. We need to clearly make recommendation to be translated into clear spatial and temporal priority in order to properly engage with the policymaker and expect to influence policy. So this is the experience of PERCA here in terms of engagement with stakeholder and connecting science with policy. I would like to end there, and I'll be happy to take some more questions later on. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Val. That was a nice, clear presentation, and kept very nicely to time. And please remember to, if you have questions for Val, please type them into the box, and we'll ask these later. So our second speaker is Edidah Ampaire. She's the project leader for a flagship project in East Africa. She's based at IITA in Uganda, another of the CG centers, and the project involves, among other activities, the creation of learning alliances at national and sub-national levels to bring together a cross-section of stakeholders involved in climate change policies. So over to you, Edidah. Thank you.
Edidah, I think you have to unmute your microphone, please.
Thank you, Philip. Good afternoon to everyone listening in. I will share with you the experiences from the project that has been operating in East Africa. We call it PACA, Policy Action for Climate Change Adaptation. And we've worked with a number of partners, not only as implementers, but also pulling synergies on bilaterals. So we had, okay. We had a policy challenge in the beginning when we started. We were able to do preliminary study that informed the project design. So these are some of the factors that we found, some of the issues, I call them constraints, that we found that pertain to policy. So we mainly focused on climate change, natural resource management, and agricultural policies. So you'll find that at formulation, and I'm going to pick out those that relate to why we finally designed to have learning alliances. There was a lot of limited stakeholder inclusion, like central government does most of the policies. They didn't sufficiently integrate gender. There was generally limited capacity, and capacity building wasn't happening as well. And harmonization and coordination challenges across actors. But when looking at implementation, then there was a limited awareness of the policies because people were not getting, the districts and lower levels were not sufficiently integrated in the policy formulation, so then they weren't aware of the policies. And some of the policies then mention actors and implementation structures that should be for enforcement. In some cases, the structures were not there, but if some which were there were even non-functional. There was also political interference. And then the other big thing was that, so cross-cutting issues are not a priority, and gender and climate change are part of these cross-cutting issues. So all those, then there was a limited enforcement at the grassroots. And you look at these constraints that are there as a policy challenge, they occur across different governance levels. Some occur at national level, repeat even at the district, others are specific to district, and others are at community level. There are other administrative levels in Uganda and Tanzania below the district level, so like the lowest. So having understood now what the challenge was, then we tried to design the project, and we set out to influence and link policies and institutions from the national level to the local level, so that the policies that are being developed could be climate resilient, but they also respond to gender needs. In terms of activities, then we did a number of activities, of course, as a research project. We analyzed the policies, to look at who is there, who are these actors in the policy, what are their roles, and then how are they connected. And we also looked at the practices, tapping through the bilateral projects into the climate smart practices, but also the trade-offs. Who's doing what and for what benefits. We also took time to analyze the gender into the policy. How did the policies, integrate gender? What was happening in terms of the real understanding gender, integrating it and budgeting for it. And we also do the policy guided scenario guided policy development. So for like scenario guided policy development, that one was particularly for the Tanzanian national environmental policy. It was a due review, so through the review we followed through, down scaling CCAFS scenarios, and then in context specific and designing the reviewed policy according to that. In terms of process, then we had multi-stakeholder platforms that were central to this project, as a way, of coming together to co-learn different stakeholders. The researchers were also learning from this, and the other communities that sit on these learning alliances, they are multi-stakeholder, including research, including academia, including farmer organizations, NGOs, civil society, media groups, private sector. And so this learning, and then in the learning we're developing strategies and tools, and then the Learning Alliance in particular was responsible for engaging on actions, policy engagement actions that were coming out of the findings of the research, bringing the research and evidence, integrating it in the learning alliances. Let me give you a specific example of the learning that was there. For example, with the climate smart coffee here in Uganda, being a big cash crop for the country, we had farmers that come in to learn, you know, getting the agronomic practices, but learning from farmers to understand what makes sense for them in terms of their economic status and what can they take on. So the investment pathways for farmers, and then the practices that they can take on, which was different from the original one of having a blanket statement for capacity building for farmers that integrates soil conservation and a lot of many practices. So the farmers can invest in different practices at different times and incrementally do so, and then they can improve. Of course, much of our outcomes were focused on changing the knowledge, attitudes, and skills. And so we would have an enhanced human capacity, better informed policy making, and inclusive policy formulation, but also collective climate change effort. So learning from the previous work for innovation platforms, we thought we would adopt the Learning Alliance approach and therefore bring together different stakeholders. So in terms of achievements, then the Learning Alliance has been able to achieve a number of things. I talked about the national environment policy for Tanzania. That's what you see there at the beginning. So that one, usually the policy development and policy reviews are done by the government officials. I said it is central, you know, like it's a central business. But in this particular one, because of the platforms, because of the Learning Alliances, they were able to invite the Learning Alliances, a specific group, so non-state actors have the opportunity to come and sit in the reviews. And so they were all benefited from the capacity building as well as giving their contributions as a group that was acknowledged at that time. For the Uganda was developing its agriculture sector strategic plan for the next 5 years. So also the non-state actors through the Learning Alliance were invited to come and make a contribution and also to attend all the, in fact, they made a specific request for them to review the draft, make contribution, and wrote a presentation paper that they presented, and their voices were heard. And the national adaptation plan for the agriculture sector in Uganda, this one they were invited, as a Learning Alliance as a group, they were invited to come and participate. So we also worked with the climate change, supported the development of the climate change mainstreaming guidelines for the agriculture sector in Uganda, and the National Learning Alliance, the district learning alliances, but were invited to come and participate. They participated from the consultations at lower levels. They also participated in the national validation. In fact, for the first time, it was the district local governments that constituted the biggest percentage of those validating, because issues were pulled from the lower level. And the other thing is that so far, the local governments that have been the learning alliances, that host learning alliances, which have been vital in planning for adaptation. There has been participatory local adaptation planning, and there's a tool that is used, the participatory land use mapping, that is used, that we developed also in the project, that they use to be able to plan for local adaptation at that level. And it's also a multi-stakeholder approach that is done through the learning alliances. They were also able, because of that planning and prioritizing, planning for different agroecological zone, prioritizing and then shifting that into the district level, they were able to really influence the development. And now the current 5-year development plans, by putting in all these detailed planning and priorities for climate change adaptation, and so they were able to influence. And 6 local governments, 2 in Tanzania and 4 in Uganda, were able to do that. Some of these local governments have been developing ordinances, specific ordinances for the coffee sector, ordinances for input, delivery, ordinances for crop, you know. So they are going on to move and to own and being able to do it. So how have all this been? There's some scaling up of these approaches that we have seen that work. For example, so the Learning Alliance as a model. We present it as a model also. One could call it an approach or a tool, but so we present it as a model. But this model also has been adopted and by some, has been scaled out. For example, in Tanzania, in the districts where we were operating, they would taken it to community level. So they do learning alliances at the community level in those target villages, and then they have people, they call ambassadors that go out and work and disseminate information and bring back information and do the monitoring. The model itself for the Learning Alliance has been implemented, has been adopted, and is being implemented by 5 non-project districts in Uganda. These are districts where they are related to bilateral, our bilateral projects that have been adopting this. They liked it, and using the participatory land use mapping, then through the stakeholder processes, and they've often called us to go and support and train them into the tool. We've developed a manual that you go and use. And so also that approach has been adopted by 4 partners. The 4 partners that work with the bilateral projects that we have. So they are adopting it and they are using it. And there's increased demand because there are also, others have also demanded. So the other thing I want to mention is that we've also, beyond this, there has been targeted engagements done by the learning alliances, like they engaged, mobilized and engaged the Ugandan Parliament on gender, the importance of gender responsiveness in policies and in Uganda. So it was the Uganda Parliament, the Tanzanian Water Commission, and in other meetings, stakeholder meetings that have been called to go and attend. So I've mentioned those, I've given those examples, but there are a range of things that the learning alliances have been involved in. For example, they participated in the development of the climate smart country, agriculture country programs, the INDCs, and in sectoral review meetings, they are invited to go and participate. So a few days ago, this week and the last week, we were able to hold the project wrap-up meetings, and the stories that the people, the implementers were sharing, you could really show that like the Learning Alliances has become a wanted group where people come, if they want to include actors, they now don't invite different ones, but they come to the Learning Alliance and say, can you come and participate? Because they know it will come with a range of actors. We also use it for content validation, for validation of the policies and strategic documents and annual action plans that are being developed. We also use them for validation of research findings and so for information dissemination. So they are doing quite a range of things. So in the review meetings that we had, these are some of the stories that they were telling us that we captured from it. The Climate Change Department in Uganda is the focal point for climate change in the country. They are scaling out the Learning Alliance as a tool for operationalizing Article 6 of the UNFCCC, and this is the capacity building. So they are scaling out to other districts. And they also reported that they formerly have operated 4 different forums on climate change, one for Parliament, another one for ministries, agencies, and departments, another one that brings other stakeholders in, but now they have a Learning Alliance, so they no longer, these ones are like inactive because they can find everybody in this one. And so because of different reasons, but including the sustaining momentum and funding, the National Learning Alliance in Uganda has trimmed down. The interested partners, there used to be many, but now there are fewer that are interested and who can pull synergies and resources and keep working on different things. In the shorter district, they managed to institutionalize the Learning Alliance in the district frame and really spoke for it, and it was brought in by the council. And so that they are the ones actually that have been scaling it, implementing it at community level. And so they are engaging the council for the budget. Last year they managed to get 10 million given for climate change that had never happened before, but they are still engaging now for more budget from own source. The Tanzania National Alliance has been integrated with the National Tanzania Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance and the task force, because some of the officials that work in there also appear in those. So they learned on the learning alliances, the thematic areas, the roles of the different thematic area leaders, and then they integrated it in there. They reported a number of changes, that it is difficult to keep momentum among members. You can see it is a variety of members who have a lot of other interests that are not common necessarily. So keeping momentum, especially generating resources that can finance them, is also a problem. But even when they have planned and have an action plan as the Learning Alliance, financing those activities is still meeting hurdles. Some of them they implement, others then they delay, things like that. They also raised the issue that they are not able to manage expectations at community. When they go like that, create awareness, talk to people, then the communities expect like they should bring solutions. And in some cases, they are not able to bring solutions. They can share their knowledge, they can do the extension, but some of the solutions like material things they cannot deliver. So they still reported they had challenges in that area. So with more observations, having worked with these platforms, we realize that the learning alliances have more impact at local level, at district and the area and the level below the district. And this is because there's a lot of regular action, the extension happens, the implementation, generally happens there. So there's always something they can work on that they can do, despite the hurdles, the challenges they still encounter, but there is always action there. So these learning alliances matter and are important at a national level for engagement purposes in particular, because we realize that it creates a voice, people can move and speak in unison and are able to influence. I mean, they can say they want an appointment in Parliament and they will get it. They can say they want to meet the top officials in the ministry, they can get it. But the issue is that they are up and vigilant when there's an engagement action to do. So keeping the momentum, especially in seasons when it's not for engagement, is a bit difficult for the national partners. But when they have something to do to come together, then they do it. And not every day that there's going to be an engagement action. So the question is around how do you momentum for people to get together, to learn together. Of course, when before we had capacity, in the beginning we had a lot of capacity building, people coming together, people learning, sharing this knowledge that is being generated. But when that goes low, then they don't have, they're not yet overcoming that. But when there's an engagement, something to do, they really come up and they do a great work. Some of the lessons that we have learned, of course, there is a big question on sustainability, but for those that have been able to institutionalize in government structures, seem to have an edge over others. There still remains something to answer about resources and how they can tap into resources. The discussions we had recently in the wrap-up, they were even talking to themselves like, no, nobody should come from outside to finance. We should look for our own means, but it's still something that is not yet 100% addressed. We also realize that it's important to link to value chain. And this value chain is also important for the private sector, meaningful private sector engagement. We take that from the coffee, where we worked with the coffee partners and where they are engaged, this is the private sector, they want it, they really come, they will engage. So linking to a value chain is easier, especially if you're a policy project and then you need to link up the value chain somehow to be able to move on. We also know that there's a need for an interested champion, and in terms of an institution, to keep a momentum in space and time. Because if, like for example, in Uganda, we were lucky that we had an NGO. The Learning Alliance, the National Learning Alliance in Uganda was hosted by an NGO. So, and so when they planned, when the Learning Alliance planned and set out the action plan, a lot of the things they wanted to do were common to some of the NGOs. And these are the NGOs that are still engaged even now, when we don't give them support to move on. So that champion is needed to be there, because once it is their interest, once it is something that they can work on and report on, then they tend to be more engaged. And for us, we come in as research. Of course, you cannot, even when you have the fund, you cannot sustain that, and they should own it anyway. So there's a need for that champion, which can be an institution that should move that. The actor inclusiveness is important to identify and attend to issues that are common interest to all stakeholders. I covered it a bit already. And then in terms of delivering tangible benefits, we need to really link up with initiatives that deliver, like technologies, technology development. If you mix it up, if you mix the policy engagement with the technology, there's work going on technologies, be it being tested, being promoted and all that, it makes sense. So there's a need for an innovation around which these people can see that they're getting tangible benefits. Those are the lessons that we've been learning over time. That's some links to the products that we have had, the papers and the info notes that you can access on our project website. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Edidah. That was a very nice presentation outlining a lot of really great work over the last few years. Please don't forget to add your questions, and we'll take those at the end. Now to our third speaker, This is Todd Crane. He's a scientist based at ILRI in Kenya. He's part of ILRI's Sustainable Livestock Systems team, and he's co-leading a flagship project operating in both East and West Africa. The project focuses on examining the links between livestock science, policy and practice, and the research is taking place in Ethiopia and Senegal. So over to you. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Phil. This presentation will perhaps be a little bit different than the other two in that we emphasize in this project much more analysis than engagement, and also that it's not just about the science policy interface, but also how do policies move into practice, how do they affect adaptive capacity of, in our case, pastoralists on the ground. So the objective of the project was twofold. First, we wanted to analyze policy formulation and implementation as a social process, focusing on interactions between the varied inputs and information streams and actors. And secondly, we wanted to look about how policy implementation affects livestock keepers' capacity to adapt to climate change. So trying to make the links between formulation and implementation and effect. Now we start with a couple of assumptions, and I almost labeled these as hypotheses that go back and forth. But the first is that policy formulation and implementation are dynamic multi-actor social processes informed by many considerations and interests. And when we say multi-actor, this is multiple actors within national governments, but also international actors, consultancies, and international NGOs. And donor agencies, and then also down to policy implementers on the ground. And our second assumption was that it would be constructive to look at the policy environment and not focus on individual policies themselves. Because there are always numerous policies in play, and when we're looking at adaptive capacity, that can be affected by a lot of different factors. And second, that the climate adaptation policies, for example, are not the only things that affect climate adaptation. Adaptive capacity is a function of a lot of socio-political factors, some of which may emerge from an adaptation initiative, some of which may stem from, as we'll see later, land reform or other initiatives. And secondly, that it will be constructive not just to look at livestock policies. We're interested in pastoral adaptation, but we realize that the space for pastoral livelihoods is shaped not just by pastoral policies, but by agricultural policies in many cases as well. As Philip has said, we are executing this through two case studies, one in Ethiopia, which is emphasizing primarily the formulation of the climate resilient green economy as a national policy process with some attention to implementation, done by a PhD student at UMass Boston. And in Senegal, we're emphasizing a little bit more the implementation of rural development policies in the Senegal River basin executed by a student at Université d'Orléans in France. Now, first in Ethiopia, the climate resilient green economy. Where did this come from was our first pressing question. Why has Ethiopia stepped in and embraced this as a national framework for implementing an entire economic reform in the end? Now, what we found is that the whole discourse of green economy is something that's been emerging a lot in international circles, and that it was picked up by the top leadership in Ethiopia, and who decided to buy into it, decided that this was not going to be a way to do your standard annual reporting, but to really transform the national economy through a whole new set of incentives, a whole new set of frameworks, and a whole new set of indicators for the implementation of both economic and environmental agendas. Ethiopia tends to have a very strong-handed national government and has along the course of the CRG has, I think, coincidentally had movements that have minimized input from civil society, though there are still many channels. An important observation about the process of policy formulation was that there were numerous different alignments and alliances between various actors that emerged through the process that weren't necessarily in place at once. And this, when we say actors, this is both political and technical, that's the scientific input, as well as national and international actors to really make this become a central organizing principle of Ethiopian economic policy up until 2030. It was also noted that part of this this framing was adopted because they recognized that this would be able to attract foreign capital investment, especially for mitigation. The research found that many Ethiopian policymakers identified that adaptation is perhaps a more pressing priority in many ways, but that it was clear that this is not as likely to attract foreign capital investment in anywhere in the near future. So that the framing for climate resilient green economy around mitigation was a way of stimulating that investment. It's noteworthy that the CRG itself was commissioned to an international consultancy to write, but was still based on Ethiopian data, which we found was used in ways that the Ethiopian government had not done much before. And I think a very important observation is that as a part of this, they developed a new performance metrics for the ministries in order to break down the traditional divide between environment and economy. Historically, and in many other places, environment is a barrier. Environmental concerns is often construed as a barrier for economic development, and the Ethiopian government recognized that that was something that needed to change in order to develop a green economy. And specifically, that the metrics to bring economics and environment together was the carbon emissions as a common currency. That economic development would be measured in terms of what are the impacts on carbon emissions or sequestration, and likewise that environmental initiatives would also be measured on their economic impact as well as their carbon emissions, so that creates some metric for comparison and integration. Focusing in on the livestock issues, that early on there was a lot of back and forth harmonizing the livestock master plan and the climate resilient green economy. Some of the more, shall we say, enthusiastic proponents in the climate resilient green economy from the environment side said one way to get the emissions down, national emissions down, is to basically liquidate the livestock sector. Obviously, that has some fairly negative consequences for pastoralists, but through the livestock master plan, which had a lot of input from both civil society and technical inputs, including from ILRI, we're able to bring that back in so that livestock development was indeed part of this climate resilient green economy. Now in Senegal, as I said, we're looking more at implementation. What we found is that indeed the policy environments around pastoralism in Senegal is quite rich. Focusing on the Senegal River Basin, we found a whole suite of policies that were affecting pastoralist access to their basic productive resources. The first is the occupation and allocation of land plans. The acronyms are from the French names. It's designed to improve land management and planning for rural communities where decentralization has been one of the major political initiatives over the last couple of decades. However, what we find is that most of these rural communes tend to be dominated by farmers, not herders, in terms of the political establishment, which, while at one hand these kind of tools for improving land use planning look like they could be helpful in guarding pastoral resources, the reality of it is perhaps not quite so optimistic. It's also important to note that while the POS was designed to strengthen local land use planning, It has been quickly circumvented by agribusiness, who got a waiver from the president himself. In this case, it was Senegal, is the oil production company in Senegal, who were not beholden to many of the restrictions in terms of trying to guard space for pastoralism. So this is part of the political economy of implementation. Relatedly, there's a World Bank funded initiative called Edidah, the Sustainable and Inclusive Agribusiness Project. It is oriented toward facilitating irrigated agriculture in the Senegal River Basin. This is both for smallholder national farmers, but also for agribusiness, both Senegalese agribusiness as well as international agribusiness. One of the major elements was agribusiness investing in very large plots. We're talking 500 acres minimum. It is the inclusive part. It means it is participatory, but I use that deliberately in quotes because the participatory element is not necessarily the major driver of the discourse and the outcomes. In the end, this emphasis on irrigation and agribusiness tends to promote fragmentation of lands that had previously been pastoral resources in the river basin, to enclose them into irrigated agricultural plots. In particular, the emphasis on irrigation has led to transformation of water resources. This has had very direct impacts on pastoralism in the region due to a non-edible weed becomes more prevalent along the water course edges, making water access more difficult, and it's also promoted a bacterial infection that's in the water that affects cow health in the lungs and respiratory system. So suddenly the water resources that are available are noxious to many of the animals. Relatedly, there's the PEDMAS, also World Bank funded, also oriented toward international linkages and agribusiness. In the area, many of the same effects as the Edidah. And finally, there's the Prefilag, a restoration project of ecological functions in the CGIAR Lake, funded by the Global Environmental Facility. This is oriented toward habitat enhancement and rejuvenating a large lake region in the Senegal River Basin. There is again some nod toward securing pastoral resources in terms of water and in terms of routes between pastures. There is some hope that this might improve water resources due to the new hydrological regime, but that remains unclear at this time because it's early days. Now, by way of conclusions emerging from these two projects with the same mandate, we have definitely confirmed that pastoral adaptive capacity is shaped by much more than adaptation or livestock policies. So when looking to engage in pastoral adaptation, we cannot look toward specific policies, because those policies exist in a policy environment which is rich in many other initiatives which may or may not have harmonized agendas. And then becomes a question of how can policies be harmonized, or how do kind of the power politics play out in the implementation of various policies. We also found that it's definitely constructive and enlightening to analyze policy making as a process, because there is a strong political economy of upstream influence in terms of the World Banks, the USAIDs, and others, in terms of national contestation of different interests within the national policymaking process itself, and then finally in the downstream implementation of how these processes or policies materialize on the ground. In Senegal, for example, out of a law on agriculture, pastoralism, and forestry, out of 52 articles in that, we found that there had been 12 that are actually implemented, largely as a function of donor interest in their implementation. So that kind of willingness to fund certain activities is a big part of that political economy about how policies are made real on the ground. And across all of this, we found that while scientific inputs may be useful, they are often, remain subordinate to political agendas, both national and international. So this willingness to invest in implementation is an important part of making policies real. In the case of the Livestock Master Plan, the ILRI Research Science actually did have a substantial input, but it took quite some negotiation in terms of how to make that harmonized with the actual implementation plans. And so I guess being last, I get to open it to questions, and here are some links to the working papers on which this presentation is based.
Thank you very much, Todd. It's an interesting focus on some of the knowledge gaps and some of the research questions that clearly need to be addressed. Okay, so thanks to all the three speakers. Now we have a few minutes for some questions and answers. So I'm now here. We've been sent. If you have questions, again, please just send them. I've got a couple of questions here for Val. So one is around what are the next steps in the rice restructuring plan? Sort of where do you see sort of future activities as far as that one's concerned?
Okay, thank you, Phil. Yeah, the next step on the rice restructuring plan, actually, in the presentation, you will see that I mentioned that there was a phase where there was a proposal for development of that restructuring plan, and that proposal has already been approved by the minister. And the next step after that, you know, there have been you know, this initiative from the government together with the World Bank to fund a project on the agricultural transformation, the VNSAT, which is the Vietnam Sustainable Agricultural Transformation Plan. So this project is currently ongoing, and you know, that actually has several room for and opportunities for engaging with policy and get some of the work that we're doing within the project to be taken into account, mainly when it comes to improving farming practices and value chain on rice. I didn't have time to mention this. For example, in my presentation, IRRI has developed the rice knowledge bank. So this is this was developed mainly to bridge the gap between research and practice in rice production, and it has an abundant wealth of information, and that can help you know, policymakers, people you know, to take several decisions. And then, you know, so you know, there's opportunity, for example, to develop you know, like a module on climate smart agriculture within that. Our project has been involved, and we are participating to the dialogue with the project. So the project, which is currently ongoing, is the continuation of that plan. And this is a plan, it's a long-term plan. So many activities are listed there.
Okay, Val, thank you. And there's another question for you here. Was the national entry point a matter of coincidence, or were you able to respond to the demand with some kind of flexible project planning? Could you please address that one?
Can you say it again?
Yeah, so the question is, was the national entry point a matter of coincidence, or were you able to respond to the demand with some kind of flexible project planning?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Luckily, for all the entry points that we have used so far, the project was able to respond to that. You know, the way we work around here at IRRI, we have different expertise here. So for the entry point that we have used so far, we reach out to scientists with some specific expertise in the area that the government is looking for, and that's how we intervene. So we keep a lot of flexibility within that. You know, whenever the demand is there, we look internally into, you know, the specific area of expertise that is needed, and that's how we are able to address that.
Okay, thank you. Now there's a couple of questions for Edidah. So Edidah, one of them is, what are the incentive mechanisms for Learning Alliance members to take part in the learning process? And the questioner says, people often see quick wins and learning alliances. They tend to take time until they yield fruit. So could you perhaps just give us a little bit of a response around sort of the incentives for members of the learning alliances?
Okay, thank you, Phil. So some of the incentives, I think they were variable for the different, because you see we have national and then we have the local at local government level. So like for some of the national is one big incentive, I think it was because people were working on, it was climate change. So we are talking about climate change and a number of actors are working on climate change. But we came in with the knowledge, you know, saying okay, we will create this, we'll have this. We first did this, understood in the countries, understood what platforms were existing and what were their roles, and could we join one of them, could we work with an existing platform. So somehow then we realized that there was already a gap, that like people are not coming together. Climate change is a phenomenon, is new, there's not a lot of knowledge there. So we said, okay, but which of these in the consultations can we work with for climate change? Many of them were commodity specific, so it was difficult, you know, like the coffee platform, the beans platform, whatever. So then it turned out that with their own recommendations that they needed to do a platform that could unify different actors, but in climate change. So like in Uganda, the focal point, the climate change department already was having a list of stakeholders working on climate change, but had not yet taken any steps on how to reach them, how to bring them. So some of those were like, you know, if something comes and is in your interest, you've always wanted to do it, but you didn't get a way of doing it. They wanted to meet, they wanted for their platform at the sectoral level, they had it in place, they formed the committee, but they had never met. They met only once to do the introductions and they didn't meet again. So they had the interests. So that when then they pulled others, that the list of actors that they had, and told them and said, this is an opportunity here. So they came in and sat. Of course, in the beginning, we had a way of managing expectations. In the beginning, there were very many numbers, you know, the turn-up would be high, over 60 people, institutions. But then they realized that actually they were not taking out any material thing. Those that they dropped, it remained, you know, trimmed between 30 and 40 that would attend. But because they were particularly interested in the topic, they thought they could learn from each other, because we are not only presenting the research findings on our project, but we are inviting other stakeholders to come and present. Explain the basics even from climate change, what is it not, and what are the technologies being. So people had an opportunity to come and share their own work. I think that was a great incentive. When you go to the local governments, the climate change is invested in the natural resources department. It's an environment issue almost, according to them, and it had been relegated to them. Like the other sectors don't care so much, it's only the environment. You guys see the environment. So it was a great opportunity again to bring people together, especially linking with the planning cycle, that they needed to develop development plans, and they needed input from other stakeholders, so then they could link with the Learning Alliance to do that. So it was more, the biggest incentive for me that I see was more of one, already wanting to do something, but not seeing the how of doing it.
Okay, thank you. Another question here on, you mentioned the scaling up of the Learning Alliance model into some other places where it was taken up, where you haven't necessarily been working. I just wondered, has any work been done on evaluating how effective those are being, or is this something that would need to be done in the future?
Come again? I didn't hear the last. I didn't understand the last part of the question.
it's really trying to evaluate or see how effective are sort of scaled up learning alliances that the project wasn't originally involved with. So are these, when you're trying to scale up things, obviously you're trying to get replication, but are these learning alliances still being, are they being effective, and are they likely to persist, or is this work that would need to be done in the future to evaluate them?
Well, I think let me start from the end. I think that there will be need to evaluate them to see what is happening, more so not evaluating performance, but knowing what is it, because they're also doing some modifications. I think it would need to be, okay, what worked for them and what didn't work. But the start is okay, because like some of these are institutions, like IFDC is doing that for their districts. So, but you see, we trade the Learning Alliance model with a participatory land use planning tool. So they get interested, they want, that tool can only be used with multi-stakeholders. It's better used with multi-stakeholders anyway. So they get interested in the tool, and then they get into a multi-stakeholder process to implement the tool, because you bring stakeholders together, they plan for the entire district, there are different interveners in the district, it can't be done by one institution. So the fact that those people scaling it up are like IFDC, like OLAM, in their districts of operation, and then they call upon us to go and take them through the tool. The money will be ready soon, and then they can go and implement it too. And we're using that tool, the local adaptation planning tool, then for me, I see that it can be effective, because then they have acquired the skills, we've had their staff trained, they can do it, and so they can see how to modify to make it appropriate to the local context. But as I said in the beginning, I think there would be need to go and see, because you are not also evaluating, but you're also looking at what is it that worked, what didn't work, and because they are following a process that we didn't follow. Because for us, we had a lot of discussions, a lot of consultations, a lot of talking to individuals even within the institutions, trying before they start. And for them now, they say, okay, it is here, come and support us. So they go get their stuff, and you go and do it. So yes, it would need to do more evaluation on it.
Okay, thank you, Edidah. Here's a question for Todd. The question is, how do you see the CRGE targets being harmonized within the sort of the bigger development ambitions of the Ethiopian government? So I think this is essentially a question about how, from such a top-down process, how do you practically or pragmatically get things done at the local scale?
Okay, it's an interesting question. I would have to preface my answer that with the fact that Wondwosen is the researcher on this, and Lance is the other most experienced in Ethiopia between us. But as I understand it, the CRGE is this is the touchstone document for all economic development in Ethiopia for the coming decade and some, up until 2030. So as I understand it, it's up to other initiatives to harmonize with it. Of course, implementation always has its challenges and hiccups, and how it translates into practice. I mean, depends on the specific localities and the specific elements of it that are being implemented in those localities. I don't know if that answers the question sufficiently, but I'm afraid I personally have a lack of detail on that topic.
Okay, Todd, thanks. Another question for Todd. This is on the Senegal study. So from your presentation, agropastoralists are caught sort of in the middle, if you like, of many different sort of drivers and forces for change. Sort of what do you see as the next, what are some of the next steps in that process of trying to implement policies or actions that can really benefit them in the face of all this, well, what's clearly a very complex policy environment?
Okay, when this research began, there's we're informed that there is a pastoral code that was under development at that time. Of course, it's noteworthy that that pastoral code was mandated to be created since 11 years already, and it was just then underway. So that might create some, some administrative anchor point for pursuing pastoral interests. But then the question is, how does that mesh with the very widespread movement toward land titling and land registration, which tends to be oriented toward sedentary agricultural production. And what we see now is that pastoralists are adapting primarily to these new political initiatives. They're adapting to the land enclosure. They're adapting to the changes in water regimes. I mean, sooner or later we'll see whether or not those policy initiatives are actually affecting their ability to deal with, say, drought in a climate-stressed year. And eventually there needs to be some political will to make pastoral adaptation and access to pastoral resources a priority. How that wins out over agribusiness investment in large-scale irrigated agriculture remains to be seen, but I think we could make some safe hypotheses that will be a tough fight. And
okay,
most of the indications are that the political will is towards sedentarizing pastoralism and trying to make it work on small plots production, which isn't typically how adaptation is approached in Sahelian pastoralism.
Right. Thanks for that, Todd. And here's a question. Could Edidah and Val reflect on the points Todd made about policy processes, in particular the issue that policy elements often only get implemented if donors actually fund them? Edidah, would you like to take a shot at that one?
Sorry, Phil. I didn't get the last bit. Policies get implemented only when
donors fund them or fund particular pieces of them.
Donors, yeah, okay. Yeah, to a greater extent, yes, I would say, but I actually don't see, from the experiences, I don't see donors implementing policies, funding implementation, except if they are funding from so many. That's why they are good policies, because they're paid for and they are done. And I think that's why the implementation is still a hiccup, but not necessarily that they are implemented. I think that the implementation gap is one reason, because they are formulated and not implemented. But from what we see is, like, it depends at what level, because the national level down to the local governments. But you see already some of the points I was highlighting is, if they are not involved in the formulation, if it's done by central government, then how can they implement when they don't have the exposure, and the majority of the time they don't have the resources? So for me, I think that if there's a linkage, if there is a linkage in the policy formulation, the policy development process is inclusive. It cuts across levels and involves the different stakeholders. The implementation can happen, also depending on the approach they use in formulation. Because if you consider that people do not understand the policies, do not know the roles are stipulated in the policies, but they don't know them, sometimes they don't address the local needs, and with meager resources, where does the commitment come from? But if they were parts and parcel of the development, like if you look at the local development plans, they implement their plans, they get some money, from own source, a lot of it, because the central government, from the central government budget that comes, 80% is committed on infrastructure. So meaning that intervention initiatives have to be funded through own source. And they still go ahead and they implement their district development plan according to the level of resources that they have. Not 100%, but according to the level of resources they have. So I think that yes and no. It's donors, through my experiences, the donors are funding more of policy development, having the instrument in place. But the local governments and the other governance levels have a role to implement. The structures are not right. Sometimes they are missing. Sometimes they are not functional. So it's a whole lot of reasons. It's not about the donor only.
Okay, Edidah, thank you very much for that response. Well, we're pretty much out of time, and so perhaps just thank you very much again to the presenters and to you questioners. A couple of very interesting issues I think that came out of this session. One is this issue around that science into policy, yes, fine, but these decisions have to be made within an entire policy environment, political environment indeed, and this can often, these are things that often will need to be taken into account. Another thing I take from this is the importance of reputation and credibility of the organizations involved, if that's going to provide scientific input into national decision-making processes. And perhaps the third point around the importance of tangible benefits for everybody involved, whether they're part of the learning alliances or whether they're parts of in policymakers and policy-making processes themselves. So before signing off, I'd just again like to thank all our speakers, and thanks to all of you for listening and for asking questions. As we mentioned before, we've made a recording of the webinar. This will be made available along with all the PowerPoint presentations, and so you'll be able to follow up if there are particular bits of literature that you'd like to follow up on. We will also do a blog summary that summarizes both of the webinars that we've done, and we'll post these on the CCAFS website. So if any of you have any questions, then please do get in touch with us. Thanks again, and goodbye.